Now the cold aim. The cattle car doors scraped open with a metallic shriek that echoed across the Bavarian valley, releasing a cloud of human desperation into the crisp February morning of 1944. Sergeant Carlos Whitefeather Mendoza stumbled onto the platform at Stalag 70A, his legs weak from 3 days without food, his uniform torn from the chaos at Anzio, where his reconnaissance unit had been overrun just weeks before. The German guards herded the new prisoners toward the main gate, their voices cutting through the mountain air with sharp commands. Mendoza noticed the way they looked at him, not with the clinical detachment they showed the other Americans, but with something approaching amusement. His dark skin and angular features marked him as different, and in this place, different meant dangerous. "Achtung! Move along, cowboys!" barked Unteroffizier Schmidt, his breath forming white clouds in the cold. "Welcome to your new home." The camp stretched before them like a geometric scar across the alpine landscape. Wooden barracks lined up in precise rows, watchtowers casting long shadows over yards of churned mud and snow. The smell hit Mendoza immediately. Unwashed bodies, coal smoke, and something else, something that reminded him of home in New Mexico. Bread, fresh bread. In the processing building, a tall officer with steel-rimmed glasses studied Mendoza's identification tags with particular interest. Hauptmann Klaus Weber had the bearing of a man who considered himself intellectually superior to everyone around him, including his own subordinates. "Reconnaissance specialist, it says here," Weber mused, his English crisp and precise. "And from New Mexico. Tell me, Sergeant, what exactly did you do before this war made you so important?" "Hunting, sir. My grandfather taught me to shoot." Weber's laugh was sharp and condescending. "Hunting! You Indians always have such romantic stories about your mystical connection to weapons. This is modern warfare, not your primitive bow and arrow games." The other prisoners shifted uncomfortably. Mendoza had learned long ago that drawing attention in situations like this was dangerous. But something in Weber's tone triggered a response he couldn't suppress. 17 confirmed kills at Anzio, sir. Before capture. American cowboy fantasies, Weber dismissed, but his eyes lingered on Mendoza's face a moment longer. "We'll see how your primitive skills serve you here." As they were led to Barracks 7, Mendoza caught sight of a figure watching from the camp's carpentry workshop. An elderly German guard, with kind eyes and calloused hands, observed the new arrivals with an expression that seemed almost sympathetic. Their eyes met briefly, before the man turned away. That night, lying on a thin mattress in the overcrowded barracks, Mendoza stared at the ceiling and thought about his grandfather's lessons. The old Navajo had called it cold aim, the ability to disconnect emotion from action, to become one with the weapon and the wind. It was more than marksmanship. It was a way of seeing the world that transcended hatred and fear. Somewhere in the darkness, another prisoner whispered about his wife's last letter. Another sobbed quietly into his pillow. But Mendoza remained still, his mind calculating distances and angles, wind patterns and sight lines, as if the camp itself were a puzzle waiting to be solved. What he couldn't know was that 800 yards away, in the narrow valley beyond the camp's northeastern perimeter, a high-speed military train would pass every Tuesday at precisely 14:47. And what he couldn't imagine was that his grandfather's teachings about cold aim would soon be put to a test that could change the course of the war itself. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How long can a man's pride survive when everything familiar has been stripped away? The routine at Stalag 7A established itself with Germanic precision. Roll call at dawn, work details assigned by noon, meals that consisted mostly of thin soup and black bread. Mendoza found himself assigned to the carpentry workshop, where the elderly guard he'd noticed on his first day turned out to be Obergefreiter Heinrich Müller, a man whose weathered hands suggested decades of working with wood. "You know tools?" Müller asked in broken English, gesturing toward a collection of saws and planes that had seen better days. Some. My grandfather was a craftsman. Good. We make furniture for officers. You work quiet, no trouble. The workshop became Mendoza's refuge from the camp's oppressive atmosphere. Here, surrounded by the familiar smell of wood shavings and the rhythmic sound of hand tools, he could almost forget where he was. Almost. But every Tuesday at 14:47, the high-speed train would thunder through the valley, carrying its mysterious cargo toward Berlin. Müller noticed his attention to the train schedule immediately. Prisoners to interrogation, he explained matter-of-factly. Intelligence officers, very important for the war effort. Mendoza filed this information away, though he wasn't sure why. His grandfather had taught him that knowledge, like ammunition, should never be wasted. Weber visited the workshop regularly, his patronizing tone becoming a weekly irritation. He seemed particularly fascinated by Mendoza's background, asking detailed questions about his pre-war hunting experiences while maintaining his air of intellectual superiority. Your people have such interesting superstitions about marksmanship, Weber observed one afternoon, watching Mendoza plane a piece of oak with practiced strokes. All this mystical nonsense about becoming one with the weapon. In modern warfare, we rely on science, mathematics, precision engineering. Yes, sir. Yet you claim to have eliminated 17 enemy positions at Anzio using, what did you call them, improvised firing solutions. Mendoza paused in his work. He could feel Müller's attention shift toward their conversation, though the older guard continued working as if he weren't listening. Sometimes the textbook doesn't account for all the variables, sir. Variables? Weber's eyebrows rose with amusement. Such as what? Wind shear around buildings. The way sound bounces off certain surfaces, how a target moves when they think they're hidden. Mendoza resumed planing, the wood curling away in thin ribbons. My grandfather called it reading the land, knowing what the environment wants to tell you. Weber laughed, but the sound lacked his usual confidence. Primitive intuition masquerading as tactical knowledge. Your grandfather's wisdom might have been useful against cavalry charges, Sergeant, but this war is won with superior technology and training. After Weber left, Müller approached Mendoza's workbench. Your grandfather, he said quietly. Was he soldier? Hunter? Tracker? He taught me that every shot tells a story about the wind, the light, the way things move when they think no one is watching. Müller nodded slowly. My father also hunter, in Black Forest. He say similar things. It was the beginning of an unlikely understanding between captor and captive, built on shared respect for craftsmanship and the knowledge that some truths transcend the temporary boundaries of war. That evening, Mendoza received his first letter from home. His sister, Elena, wrote about rationing in New Mexico, about their mother's prayers, about the way the whole community gathered to support families with sons overseas. She mentioned the old rifle their grandfather had left him, the Remington 700 with the walnut stock that had been in the family for generations. We buried it in the yard behind the house, she wrote. Figured the government would want to confiscate it for metal, and grandfather always said that rifle had work left to do. Mendoza folded the letter carefully and slipped it inside his jacket. Outside, the February wind howled through the barracks walls, carrying with it the distant sound of artillery from some far-off front. But in his mind, he was back in the New Mexico hills, learning patience and precision from an old man who understood that the most important battles were often fought with a single, perfectly placed shot. What would you trust more in a place like this? What you were taught to believe, or what your own eyes show you? March brought rumors that traveled through Stalag 7A like smoke through ventilation shafts. The Allies had broken through somewhere in Italy. The Russians were pushing west faster than German reinforcements could move east. But most intriguing to Mendoza were the whispered conversations about unusual activities among some of the guards, small acts of kindness that seemed to contradict their training. Müller had begun leaving extra pieces of bread near Mendoza's workbench, always with a gruff comment about not wanting good woodcraftsmen to faint from hunger. Other prisoners reported similar gestures. A blind eye turned during extended mealtimes, medical supplies that appeared in barracks without explanation, and guard schedules that seemed deliberately predictable. "Something's happening," said Private Tommy Morrison, the young soldier who bunked next to Mendoza. "My cousin's in Barrack 12, and he swears the guards there are acting different, like they're waiting for something." Mendoza had noticed it too. The Tuesday train schedule had become almost ceremonial in its precision, but lately he'd observed an increased number of maintenance inspections in the carpentry workshop that coincided exactly with the 1447 passage. Miller would find urgent reasons to send other prisoners on errands, leaving Mendoza alone in the workshop, just as the train thundered through the valley. It was during one of these solitary moments that Mendoza first noticed the wooden crate hidden behind a stack of lumber. The crate was cleverly disguised as part of the workshop's storage system, but his grandfather's training had taught him to spot things that didn't belong. This crate was too well made, too carefully positioned, and too purposefully concealed. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth and disassembled into components, was a rifle. Not just any rifle, a Remington 700 with a walnut stock that looked identical to his grandfather's gun. Attached was a crude but functional scope, crafted from salvaged binoculars, and a note written in careful English. "Sergeant Mendoza, your reputation preceded your capture. We have work that requires your particular skills. Trust Heinrich. Trust the schedule. Lives depend on precision." It was signed simply MD. Mendoza's hands trembled as he touched the familiar grain of the walnut wood. Officially, his grandfather's rifle had been destroyed when his unit was overrun at Anzio in February 1944. But this weapon, impossibly, seemed to have found its way to him through methods that defied explanation. When Miller returned an hour later, his face revealed nothing, but his eyes carried a weight of shared conspiracy. "Some things," Miller said quietly, "are more important than uniforms." "How?" Frenchwoman, very determined. "She say you eliminated 17 positions at Anzio with impossible shots. Say you can hit targets that conventional marksmen cannot even see." Weber arrived for his weekly inspection, just as Mendoza was sliding the last rifle component back into its hiding place. The German intelligence officer seemed more agitated than usual, his questions sharper and more personal. "I've been thinking about our previous conversations, Sergeant. This mystical approach to marksmanship your grandfather taught you. Can you explain how it actually functions?" Mendoza continued working, his voice steady despite the racing of his heart. "It's about reading variables that can't be calculated mathematically, sir. The way wind moves differently around obstacles. How the rhythm of a moving target creates patterns." "Patterns?" "Everything that moves has a heartbeat, sir. Trains, vehicles, even people. If you can synchronize with that rhythm, you can predict where the target will be before it gets there." Weber studied him intently. "And you believe this? Intuitive approach is superior to scientific precision." "I think they work together, sir. Science tells you what should happen. Instinct tells you what will happen." After Weber left, Müller approached the workbench where Mendoza was measuring angles with improvised tools made from matchsticks and thread. "Next Tuesday," Müller said quietly, "train carries 12 Allied intelligence officers to Berlin for interrogation, very important men with very dangerous information." "Under about what?" "Normandy coast, defensive positions. If Germans extract this information..." Müller's expression grew grave. "Many Allied soldiers die in invasion." Mendoza understood. The precision shot required would not be about killing, but about saving lives, about using his grandfather's gift of cold aim to rescue men whose knowledge could turn the tide of the war. "Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this?" Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. When everything you believed about your enemies starts to crumble, what do you use to rebuild your understanding of the world? The week that followed brought attention to Stalag 7A that felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Mendoza spent hours studying the train's approach from his position in the carpentry workshop, timing the engine's rhythm, calculating wind patterns with tools improvised from matchsticks and thread. The margin for error was impossibly small. A difference of 2 seconds would mean the difference between rescuing 12 Allied intelligence officers and accidentally killing them. Weber's visits became more frequent and more pointed. The German intelligence officer seemed to sense something was different, though he couldn't identify what. He continued to mock Mendoza's primitive skills while unconsciously providing crucial intelligence about the train's schedule and passenger manifest. The Tuesday transport is quite efficient, Weber mentioned casually during one afternoon inspection. High-value prisoners reach Berlin in excellent condition for proper interrogation. We've found that fear improves memory significantly. Müller's role in the conspiracy became clearer through subtle communications. A gesture toward the hidden rifle components, a whispered comment about wind direction, the way he arranged for other prisoners to be absent from the workshop during critical planning moments. French resistance, Müller explained quietly one evening as they worked alone. They place explosive charges along track, but timing must be perfect. Too early, and transport continues. Too late, and intelligence officers die with their secrets. How do I signal the detonation? Metal bell attached to undercarriage of third passenger car. Your bullet strikes bell, creates acoustic signal. French woman waits in valley below with detonator. She hears tone. She knows when to trigger charges. The plan required a precision that bordered on the impossible. The train moved at approximately 45 miles per hour through a narrow valley where wind shear created unpredictable air currents. The shot would have to travel 847 yards, strike a target no larger than a dinner plate on a moving train, and create an acoustic signal clear enough to be heard over the engine noise. But Mendoza had begun to understand something his grandfather had tried to teach him years ago in the New Mexico mountains. Cold aim wasn't about suppressing emotion. It was about achieving a state of perfect clarity where emotion, instinct, and technical skill merged into something greater than their individual components. He practiced the mental discipline nightly, lying in his bunk and visualizing every aspect of the shot. The train's approach curve, the way morning light would affect visibility, the slight vibration from the camp's generator that would affect his firing position. All of these factors became part of a complex equation that existed not in mathematics, but in the deeper knowledge his grandfather had called reading the land. On the Friday before the operation, Mendoza received another letter from his sister Eleanor. She wrote about a visit from army officials who had come to inform the family that he was missing in action, presumed captured or dead. His mother had refused to believe it. She says grandfather's spirit is watching over you, Elena wrote, that the rifle we buried will find its way to you when you need it most. I know it sounds like superstition, but sometimes the old ways know things that modern thinking can't explain. Mendoza folded the letter and tucked it inside his jacket next to the first one. Outside, snow had begun to fall, creating a white blanket that would muffle sound and potentially affect visibility. Another variable to calculate, another factor in an equation that grew more complex by the hour. Weber made his final visit to the workshop that Friday afternoon, his demeanor more agitated than usual. I've been thinking about your claims regarding improvised firing solutions, Sergeant. In particular, how you account for variables that traditional ballistics cannot predict. It's about patience, sir. Waiting for the moment when all the variables align. And when is that moment? Mendoza met Weber's gaze steadily. When the land tells you it's ready. Weber left without his usual mocking laughter. That evening, Müller brought news that would make the operation even more critical than they had imagined. "Intelligence officers carry more than information about Normandy," he whispered. "They have complete plans for Allied invasion, date, time, landing sites, everything Germans need to prepare perfect defense." The weight of responsibility settled on Mendoza's shoulders like a heavy blanket. 12 lives hung in the balance, but beyond that, the entire future of the war might depend on a single shot fired by a captured American sergeant using skills his grandfather had learned hunting in the mountains of New Mexico. How do you prepare for a moment when everything depends on trusting abilities that others dismiss as primitive superstition? Tuesday morning dawned clear and cold across the Bavarian Valley, with visibility that stretched for miles in every direction. Mendoza woke before the 5:30 roll call, his body instinctively aware that this day would either justify his grandfather's teachings or prove Weber's mockery correct. The morning work detail proceeded normally, with Mendoza and 3 other prisoners assigned to the carpentry workshop under Müller's supervision. But as 14 Nordkreuz approached, subtle signals began to activate the conspiracy that had been months in the making. Morrison created a distraction in the main yard by deliberately dropping a bucket of nails, causing guards to converge on the cleanup effort. Another prisoner staged a minor medical emergency in Barracks 3, drawing the attention of the duty officer and 2 additional guards. Within minutes, the workshop area was effectively isolated. Müller unlocked the hidden compartment and began assembling the Remington 700 with movements that suggested he had done this before. The rifle came together like a puzzle whose solution had been predetermined: stock, barrel, bolt mechanism, and finally the crude but functional scope crafted from salvaged German binoculars. "French woman is Marie Dubois," Müller said quietly as he worked. "She recovered your rifle from Anzio battlefield, spent 4 months organizing delivery through network of sympathetic guards and bribed officials. Piece by piece, hidden in Red Cross parcels, tool shipments, even concealed within prisoner's prosthetic leg." Mendoza ran his fingers along the familiar walnut grain, feeling the same texture his grandfather's hands had known for decades. The weapon felt like an extension of his will, exactly as it had during those brief weeks of combat before capture. "Why risk this for me?" "Because some abilities cannot be taught in military school," Müller replied. "Your 17 confirmed kills at Anzio were not luck. They were shots that defied standard doctrine, bullets that found targets through impossible angles. Your unit whispered about shots that seemed to curve around obstacles." At 14:35, they moved to the workshop's storage room, where a carefully concealed firing position provided an unobstructed view of the valley. The train track curved around a steep embankment exactly 800 yards from the window, creating a perfect firing lane for someone who understood how to compensate for distance, wind, and the movement of a high-speed target. Mendoza settled into position, his breathing automatically shifting to the rhythm his grandfather had taught him. Cold aim required complete emotional detachment, not the suppression of feeling, but the integration of all sensation into a single moment of perfect clarity. The train appeared at 14:46, exactly on schedule. Its black locomotive pulled 6 cars through the mountain pass, the 3rd car carrying 12 Allied intelligence officers whose knowledge of Normandy's defensive positions could determine the success or failure of the coming invasion. Through the scope's crosshairs, Mendoza could see the metal bell mounted on the undercarriage of the 3rd passenger car. The target was small, the distance extreme, and the window of opportunity measured in fractions of seconds. But as he synchronized his heartbeat with the train's rhythm, all the variables began to align exactly as his grandfather had promised they would. Wind direction, steady from the northwest at approximately 8 miles per hour. Train speed, 45 miles per hour through the curve. Ambient temperature, cold enough to affect bullet trajectory by approximately 2 inches at this distance. Generator vibration, creating a subtle tremor every 3.2 seconds that had to be accounted for in the timing. 800 yards away, in the valley below, Marie Dubois waited with her hand on the detonator. trusting completely in the shooting ability of a man she had never met. Mendoza breathed out slowly, feeling that moment of perfect stillness his grandfather had called becoming one with the weapon and the wind. The crosshairs settled on the specific rivet where his bullet would strike the bell mechanism, creating the acoustic signal that would trigger the detonation sequence. The Remington fired once. The bullet traveled 847 yards in 1.2 seconds, striking the bell with perfect accuracy. The clear, sustained tone carried across the valley, reaching Dubois' ears exactly as the passenger car, containing the Allied officers, passed over the resistance explosives. The train derailed precisely as planned, the passenger car separating cleanly from the engine and rolling to a controlled stop in a meadow, where resistance fighters waited to extract the intelligence officers and their crucial knowledge of German defensive positions along the Normandy coast. But perhaps more importantly, the operation demonstrated that the skills Weber had mocked as primitive represented a form of precision that industrial warfare could neither replicate nor replace. When everything you were taught about modern warfare meets something older and deeper than textbooks can explain, which truth do you trust? Weber arrived at the workshop 17 minutes after the shot, drawn by reports of gunfire from guards stationed on the camp's northeastern perimeter. He found Mendoza calmly planing wood shavings at his workbench, the Remington already disassembled and its components distributed among a dozen different hiding places throughout the camp. "What was that noise?" Weber demanded, his usual composure cracked by the obvious sound of a high-powered rifle. "Hammering a stubborn nail, sir," Mendoza replied without looking up from his work. "Sometimes the old wood doesn't want to cooperate." Weber studied the workshop with suspicious eyes, but Müller's decades of experience had left no evidence visible to casual inspection. The hidden compartment remained concealed. The firing position showed no signs of recent use, and the acoustic signature of a rifle shot could easily be confused with the various industrial sounds that echoed through the valley. "The train derailed," Weber said, watching Mendoza's face carefully for any reaction. "Mechanical failure, apparently. Though some guards report hearing unusual sounds from this area, can't say I noticed anything unusual, sir." Weber lingered for another 10 minutes, his intelligence officer's instincts clearly telling him that something significant had occurred. But without concrete evidence, he could only file his suspicions away for future reference and hope that the mechanical failure story would satisfy his superiors in Berlin. The rescued intelligence officers carried with them detailed plans for German defensive positions along the Normandy coast. Information that proved crucial to the success of the D-Day landings 3 months later. But the operation's impact extended far beyond its immediate tactical value. In the weeks that followed, Mendoza noticed subtle changes throughout Stalag 7A. Guards began treating prisoners with slightly more consideration. Small acts of kindness became more frequent. The rigid antagonism that had defined the camp's atmosphere began to soften into something resembling mutual respect between human beings trapped in circumstances beyond their control. Müller continued to supervise the carpentry workshop, but their relationship had evolved into something approaching friendship. They worked together in comfortable silence, two craftsmen who understood that some truths transcended the temporary boundaries of war. "Your grandfather would be proud," Müller said one afternoon as they shaped wood for officer furniture that would likely never be used. "You honored his teachings. He always said the most important battles are fought with single shots," Mendoza replied. "But I don't think he meant just the rifle." Liberation came in April 1945, when American forces overran Stalag 7A and found prisoners and guards alike preparing for an orderly surrender. The Remington remained hidden in the camp until Allied intelligence officers conducted their post-liberation debriefing, when Müller quietly revealed the location of the disassembled weapon and told the story of the February rescue operation. Mendoza returned to New Mexico, carrying with him not the rifle, which became part of the official record of resistance operations in Bavaria. But the knowledge that his grandfather's teachings about cold aim had helped change the course of history. The weapon itself became a symbol of how traditional knowledge, dismissed by modern military doctrine, could provide solutions that technology alone could not achieve. But the most profound change was in Mendoza himself. He had entered captivity as a soldier trained to see only enemies, and emerged as a man who understood that even in war's darkest moments, small acts of humanity could bridge the artificial divisions that conflict created between people who shared more than they differed. Years later, when veterans gathered to tell their stories, Mendoza would speak quietly about the German guard who risked his career to save Allied lives, the French resistance fighter who trusted a stranger with an impossible mission, and the grandfather whose wisdom proved that some knowledge runs deeper than any textbook could teach. He never spoke about the rifle's impossible journey from an Anzio battlefield to a Bavarian prison camp. Some stories, he learned, were too important to be reduced to mere facts and documentation. But on quiet evenings in the New Mexico mountains, when the wind carried echoes of distant times and places, Mendoza would run his fingers over the walnut stock of a new rifle and remember the clear tone of a bell struck by a bullet, traveling 847 yards through mountain air, carrying with it the hopes and fears of 12 men whose names he never learned, but whose lives became part of his own story. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What would you remember more? The moment you proved your doubters wrong, or the moment you discovered your enemies were human too?